LBC, I'm Holly Jones.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to Monday's Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale. On the panel tonight we have with us Iain Dunt, columnist with the newspaper, podcaster and author of How to Be a Liberal. Dalia Gebriel is an academic and commentator. Giles Whittell is World Affairs editor at Tortoise Media. His new book is called The Great Escape. It's all about the raid on Saint-Nazaire. What did I say? No,
you
not
said
Great Escape.
The great, even more exciting.
The Greatest Raid. Why do I always get it wrong? The word is there in front of me. Anyway, Russell Quirk joins us too. Let's see if I can get his title right. Property entrepreneur and commentator.
Thank you very much.
Thank goodness for that. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask our panel a question. And you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to our first question. It's from Peter in Woking. Peter, what would you like to ask?
Yeah, hi, Ian. If we say that the President of the United States should not say what he thinks about Putin because we are worried that it might escalate into a nuclear war, does that mean that we let Putin get away with even more murders of innocent civilians and children and human rights abuses?
Well, let's just remind ourselves of what he did say. These were unprepared remarks at the end of a speech that he gave in Poland on Saturday, I think it was. He said, for God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. Giles, let's come to you first.
No, I don't think it means that Putin gets away with everything. I think there is a world in which we can expect the leader of the free world to stay on message, at least on topics that could lead to nuclear escalation. So in that world, Biden would not have said that. He would have kept on message, and the summary would have been up to the NATO border and no further. And I think it's fair to say that, to answer your question, why does he not get away with it in those circumstances? It all comes down to very basic logistic things at the moment. It's a complicated operation, but it's, can you get enough of the weapons that they need in overland in time for them to be effective against the Russian forces who are threatening to encircle Kharkiv and Kiev? If you can, what the past month has shown is that he doesn't get away with it, and you can stop the killing, and you can send the biggest land army in the world, apart from the Chinese one, home.
Russell.
Yeah, I think, understandably, I guess Biden's been criticised for kind of empowering Putin by way of these remarks. I think it's clear that the message really, though, was to the Russian people, and far from it being some kind of clandestine effort on Biden's part to suggest that he himself was going to send forces in and unseat Putin. That's clearly not the case. But it is a message, if it should ever get through, to the Russian people that, of course, they should be thinking about how to get rid of this madman, frankly. But I think there's also a wider point around politics and politicians generally in terms of this culture that we seem to have in front of us now, where politicians are deterred from speaking their minds. They are deterred from saying what they think. And I'm not sure that does the electorate in any country much of a service, frankly.
But the problem is that there are so many occasions when the White House have had to clarify Biden's remarks.
Well,
not just this, but over the past few weeks, I've got a whole list of examples here. Now, OK, he's not the first president where that's happened. I'm sure it happened with George Bush, Ronald Reagan, and probably one or two before that too. But it doesn't inspire confidence, does it?
But he is the so-called elected president of the free world, and therefore, if he has something to say, and actually to me it didn't look as though it was ad-libbed. If you watch him in that speech, and I've watched it 2 or 3 times, it looks as though he's still reading the teleprompter, which I think is rather odd and seems to be very at odds with the fact that it was supposed to be an ad-lib remark. I'm not sure it was.
Dalia.
Well, I don't think that it is the job of politicians during incredibly fraught moments like this to be wearing their heart on their sleeves. Their job is to be strategic, especially if we are talking about preventing the further deaths of innocent Ukrainians. This is not a time to be loose-lipped. This is not a time to be footloose. It's incredibly important that at the moment, Putin is in a very precarious position. It is becoming increasingly clear now that he overestimated the power of his own army. He underestimated the resilience of the Ukrainian resistance. He is in a very vulnerable spot. Now is the point at which a pathway to de-escalation can actually be carved out. And that doesn't happen by accidentally throwing further fire onto a very hot situation.
Iain?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a bit of a recurring theme, and he does seem to keep on making these mistakes. However, I think it is important to be clear about what he has succeeded at over this period. And he has succeeded, I think, in quite remarkable ways, chiefly of all, really the freezing of Russia's foreign currency reserves. Of all the sanctions that we have seen hit Russia, of all the pain that we see on them, becomes because of that decision was he led overwhelmingly. The Europeans backed it up and we backed it up behind that. But ultimately, it is a dollar world that we live in. Now, that caused severe pain. The quite elegant move of removing commodities so that you could keep the Western alliance together by not posing too much of a threat on energy that would have alienated Europe. Smart, canny tactics that he used against Putin. The early warnings, the really quite extraordinary, almost eccentric but quite genius move to just start publishing your intelligence about what you thought Russia was going to do in a way to decalibrate the disinformation campaign.
Good intelligence.
Good intelligence. Now that, I think, has been a really accomplished, really impressive record for Biden. I accept that he is gibbering away a bit. Some of the comments he made to American troops about what you will see when you go out there, you just thought, what are you doing? You must stop talking now. Absolutely, that's true. But overwhelmingly, his record on this has been very impressive, I think.
I said earlier on the programme that I thought it was quite interesting that a lot of the people that are jumping to his defence about these comments about regime change are exactly the same people that criticised George Bush for wanting regime change in Iraq. I mean, do you find that ironic at all?
The trouble is that I don't think that they're comparable situations. I mean, Iraq was a war of aggression. You know, it was a war against a country that, yes, he was a tyrant, but he wasn't doing anything to invade another country at that moment. And that is not where we are right now. Where we are right now is you know, an abysmal invasion that breaks any kind of international law and that suggests that he's the kind of leader who will keep on doing this unless he is taught a lesson about what the consequences of it are. And in that context, I don't think it's morally equivalent to talk about regime change here as it is in the original example.
Let's take a sort of allied question on this. Peter, thank you for that. Let's go to Harry in Bristol. Harry, what would you like to ask?
My question is essentially, at the next US election, it looks probable that a unpopular Biden is going to run and a disgraced Trump is going to run. And at the last British election, we were offered Johnson or Corbyn. And I'm just wondering whether there seems to be this trend across the West of incompetent and or immoral leaders being offered at elections.
Dalia.
Well, I think that we are... The choice that the Americans are looking to have in the next election is very similar to the choice that they looked to have in the previous election, which was, again, a deeply unpopular Joe Biden against a, frankly, dangerous and terrifying Trump. And so I think what we see in the US in particular is a thwarting of democratic process, particularly because obviously the US is quite a different system to here, where you don't have sort of democratic party politics. You have very much an elite within the Democrat Party, an elite within the Republican Party that sort of hand select candidates. And what that means is that you have...
It's not quite true, is it? Given the primary and caucus system. I mean, that is party members doing it. They didn't have to pick Biden. There were 20 other candidates.
Well, they don't have party membership in the way that we have here, where you have people, ordinary people who are involved in the process from beginning to end. You have people who are registered as Democrats, registered as Republicans, who are able to vote at very particular points of the process. But what I think the problem here is that the hold on the political system that we see there means that a very small number of people with, who are very embedded in the Washington culture, although actually, funnily enough, we didn't see this work out with Trump. I don't think that Trump was the Washington Republicans' choice. But it does mean that we end up having two candidates that are not particularly liked by anyone, not particularly reflective of the position that is held by most people in the country. And then, that is a kind of crisis in political democracy. We've seen disillusionment in the political process, and that is ultimately deeply unhealthy. And it means that we are not having our political actors behaving and doing policy in a way that is reflective of the needs of the people. And so I think the democratizing of the process from the local all the way up to the national is how we avoid being in this undesirable situation time and time again.
Iain Dunt, is Dalia right there? Because in British parliamentary selections, a candidate can be selected by maybe 30 people who happen to be in the room. At least in America, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people taking part in the selection process.
Oh, God, it's a better system than the one that we've got. I mean, you'll know better than I do. I mean, you go to MP selection processes, it's an extremely depressing spectacle to view by usually quite eccentric sort of party members who aren't really that similar to the amount that people vote in the real country. Doing it through a quick hustings, very sort of quick and easy and quite cheap as a process financially. No, it's a much worse system than the one that they have in the US. But I don't know, I don't want to be funny about this, but I feel like I'm going to defend Biden again. I think Biden's sort of all right. He's got a kind of... I mean, he's a little bit boring, but boring's quite good in politics. We've had more than enough sort of super colourful politicians recently that makes me think, well, you know what, I wouldn't mind a few more boring ones. He is a bit boring, but if you look at his record so far, it has, I repeat, been really quite impressive. I hope I didn't spend the whole evening
really?
having... Yeah.
Afghanistan, you think that was impressive?
Afghanistan, as I think we talked about last time I was here, was an absolute disaster for him. And at that point, we just thought, okay, this is it. We've basically got an America first foreign policy president with a sort of much more liberal domestic policy. But what he's done on Ukraine, I think, has put most of those fears away. I mean, his record has been infinitely more impressive on Ukraine. So you look at it and I just sort of feel, I don't want to spend my whole night defending Biden because he isn't the most inspiring man in the world, but apparently that's what I'm going to do.
Russell.
So maybe Ian's defending Biden just because he's not Trump, perhaps. Maybe that's...
Well, it's an easy thing to do.
It's a very good quality to have, but not the only one.
But it does make you wonder why a nation of 270 million people can only come up with either Biden, Trump or Hillary Clinton previously. I think that the point is that the party system, whether it's in the US or the UK, is fundamentally broken. I mean, this democracy thing, it's not really what the Greeks invented, is it? And I think the party system, and I, having gone through selection, not at MP level, but I was a Conservative councillor that then went independent a number of years ago, it's completely stilted. It's completely manipulated. It is about hands on shoulders. It's about, in the US, money and the money you bring with you. It's about cronyism. It's about favours. And I've seen situations in the UK when it comes to the Conservative Party in particular, I know the Labour Party has a different process, where it's kind of jobs for the boys, jobs for the girls. It's, if you're a bag carrier to a certain highly prominent minister or MP, you will get put on the stage by that local association rather than someone, for instance, in my constituency, Brentwood, rather than someone local. My constituency of Brentwood hasn't seemed to have managed to select a local MP since the 1980s.
Well, you had Eric Pickles for all those years.
From Keighley in Yorkshire.
Yeah, he was rather good, though, wasn't he?
In some respects.
No wonder you went independent.
I'm sure he believes so.
Giles.
Well, in answer to the question, it is a pretty unappetizing smorgasbord that democracy has given us in the UK, in the US, and that is why Xi Jinping in China and Vladimir Putin in Russia are seizing on it and with a straight face, right into the camera, proposing... They actually, in Russia they call it managed democracy, in China they have another word for it, but they actually call their system democratic, and they say with a straight face that it is more representative and certainly more effective than our systems. And it's a terrifying situation that we're in. It is autocracy versus democracy. That's why, quite apart from the human suffering, the war in Ukraine is a war for the world. Everything Zelensky says about that is right. The only thing that I would say is I agree, Ian, on the holes in the system over here. Don't get me started on our unelected upper chamber. Don't get me started on our unelected head of state.
We won't, because we have to go to a break in a minute.
Then I'll stop.
But you have a point.
Just on what you said about the Russians and Chinese, I just recalled, but at the age of 15, standing on the West German border with East Germany, seeing all the guard towers, saying to my teacher, why is it called the German Democratic Republic? The innocence of a 15-year-old. Thank you very much indeed for your call there, Harry. We'll come to more in a moment. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC's Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale. It's 16 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 90 minutes past 8 on LBC. With me, Dalia, Gebriel, academic and commentator, Iain Dunt, author of How to Be a Liberal. Giles Whittell is the author of The Greatest Raid, and Russell Quirk is a property entrepreneur and commentator. Your new book, The Greatest Raid, 45 seconds, elevator pitch.
It's exactly 80 years since 260-odd commandos set out from Falmouth to attack the most heavily defended port on the western seaboard, to deny its use to Hitler, specifically for his biggest battleship. 1 in 4 of them died, more than in any comparable operation. It did achieve its goal, however, because they filled a fake German destroyer with 4 tons of high explosives and blew up the dry dock, and Churchill was able to notch it up, principally as a propaganda success.
Why don't we know more about it? I suppose that's why you've written the book, to make sure that we do. But it's not one of the more famous episodes of the war, is it?
No, it's a good question. There's a whole sort of community of people who live for the raid on Saint-Nazaire and commemorate it every year. And for the first time since COVID, they'll be there in Saint-Nazaire now. And they are welcomed by the French community and thanked every year from the bottom of their hearts. You were the ones who gave us hope, the first French Prime Minister after the war said. But it was a relatively small operation, much smaller than the raid on Dieppe, which was both big and a big disaster. Obviously much smaller than D-Day. And it came at a point in middle of early part of 42 when everything was going wrong. I make the argument in the book that, as you would expect, you've got to make an argument in a book. This was a turning point.
Ian didn't.
You still haven't read my book, Ian.
We'll come on to that in a bit.
But it was a turning point of sorts. It showed for the first time that you could take on the Germans on their soil, or occupied France, and actually turn them around and send them running.
I think I need to do a podcast with you for my book club podcast on your book.
Excellent.
My people will talk. Well, actually, I don't have any people. I'll talk to you myself. Right, let's go to our next question. It is from Ellie in Stratford-upon-Avon, and it's a text question. Should we be concerned that it appears Russia poisoned Abramovich and the Ukraine negotiators? Surely this shows there's no interest in peace at all. Russell?
If true, and of course, look, with all this misinformation and disinformation flying around, given that it's the Russians here, we've got absolutely no way of knowing if it is true or not. I think the greater kind of question is what on earth Abramovich is doing, negotiating between the Ukrainians and the Russians. You know, given that he's supposed to be in Putin's pocket, I suggest perhaps, if I was a cynic, it's to get his houses and his yachts back, perhaps. But I think that's more surprising and more strange than anything else, don't you?
It is a bit odd because, I mean, why would they poison him as well as the Ukrainian negotiators, just to throw us off the scent?
I think there's always a bit of an overestimation as to how much Putin needs his oligarch ecosystem and the manner in which he treats them. It's absolutely true that, like, he is he is a sort of intermediary between elite forces within Russia, and that ultimately, if/when he goes, it'll be because he ceases to function as that intermediary. But he is not that reliant on the oligarchs, and when they start misbehaving, when they turn against him, he is liable to be extremely sadistic and brutal in the manner in which he treats them. And again, like you say, if this story is true, we're still at the early stages, but the early indications are that it very well could be, then I would suggest that it's probably an example of that.
But Giles, I mean, if it is all true, it's just brazen, isn't it? I mean, Salisbury was one thing, but I mean, it's quite difficult to draw any other conclusion that Putin's people were behind this in some shape or form.
It's brazen, but I mean, look, as many questions as it answers. As far as we know, if true, this happened in Kiev, right? So a poisoning task force got there and did it there. As far as we know, death squads sent to assassinate Zelensky didn't get that far. But so there's this slightly unnerving Russian presence right in the heart of the machine in Kiev. Yes, it's unnerving because it's mad. It's the same Cold War obsession with poisons. The story, as I've read it so far today, is that this is not necessarily on Putin's own orders, but on a group of Putin-associated people who don't want the peace talks to go anywhere. I wouldn't assume that they necessarily represent Putin's own current thinking on this. I mean, he has shown himself to be mad by going to war at all, but he will have to make some fairly cold-eyed calculations about how many of his people are being killed and when and whether to take an off-ramp if it's offered.
Let's just remind ourselves of the question, should we be concerned that it appears Russia poisoned Abramovich and the Ukraine negotiators? Surely this shows there's no interest in peace at all. Dalia.
You could have stopped at should we be concerned as just a general question for this evening, because it feels like every day we wake up and there's just a new reason to be terrified. But I think I actually completely agree. I think that there is a strong chance, obviously we don't know anything in terms of details, or this hasn't been verified yet, but I think there is a good chance that this could have come from within Moscow, not necessarily directly from Putin. From the perspective that, maybe Abramovich is seen as a traitor for even participating in peace negotiations, because it does just seem so irrational that it would come from Putin himself, because, as I said earlier in the show, we are seeing kind of the last humiliated gasps, I think, of a desperate regime. It's becoming increasingly untenable, the Russian presence within Ukraine. And that's both because of the international community's response. It's also because of the resistance put up by the Ukrainians. And so when we see kind of like the lashing out in the form of, for example, threats to curb entry to Russia from unfriendly states, or seeing, the ongoing siege of Mariupol, something like this would very much sit within that context. I think whether or not it's come directly from Putin or not, it seems a bit less likely. But it's certainly, to have this happen at this moment, to see Moscow derailing these talks with the use of chemical weapons above all, that's an incredibly difficult, shocking precedent to be setting.
And can I be the token conspiracy theorist on the panel? I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but some people will be listening to this saying, well, what if it wasn't the Russians? What if this was a false flag event? What if this was designed just to kind of turn the screws? Not that they need the screws turned on them anymore, as in Putin and the Russians, or Putin in terms of what he's orchestrating. But it's not beyond the realms of possibility that it was carried out by somebody else to make it look like it was Putin.
Well, it's a thought. We'll leave it at that. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Right, let's go to Adam in Bermondsey. Hello, Adam.
Hey, panel. Hope you're all well.
Hi.
I was just calling to see if I could ask the panel, in light of Nadeem Zahawi and Kemi Badenoch's recent discussions about what we should be teaching children about the positives of colonialism and slavery, I just wanted to say, or ask you all what you thought we could be telling the young people, and I could be telling my younger family members, were the benefits of Britain's colonial past. And obviously, I assume at one point we'll be saying the positives of what Germany did as well. I assume we're going in that line. It just makes logical sense. So I just wanted to ask you all.
I mean, can you quote me what
benefits were?
Can you quote me what Kemi Badenoch or Nadeem Zahawi have said the positives of slavery are? Because I have to say that's a new one on me.
Funnily enough, I was really surprised, but he said that his family, I think his family's from Iraq, and colonialism benefited him because it meant that he got to come over here or something. I was quite surprised that somebody of colour would say this.
You said that they had said there were positives about slavery, which I find difficult to imagine.
I interpret as a Caribbean person colonialism to be. That's why I just want to ask you all, is maybe you don't see it as slavery, but maybe you can say you've brought, I don't know, the English language to us. What can I be telling my family and friends and younger people the benefits of colonialism and enslavement of black people were to the younger people? Yeah.
Iain Dunt, Adam is there equating colonialism with slavery. First of all, is that a fair thing to do?
Well, I mean, one was involved in the other, but they are obviously separate categories. You could have colonialism without slavery. You could probably have slavery without colonialism. Zahawi's comments are part of a government agenda that we've seen played out over and over again now, which is basically to say, we want the statues to stay up. We want to talk about the benefits. We need to say what were the good things of our past, and not just the negatives, as if there's this sort of conspiracy on the left to make this incredibly black and white story. I mean, the thing is, what he's saying is sort of true in a really uninteresting way, in that you're always going to take an objective view in any kind of history lesson of anything, and you'll probably find positives in almost any sort of scenario that you look at, and you're going to find negatives. The overwhelming assessment of colonialism is that it was a very, very negative process to have gone through, and a deeply immoral one. So, of course, that is just simply where we are right now, and that's where we were there for many, many people assessing it at the time. Now, the bit that's interesting about it is what the political agenda is. Because you can almost hear in the way that he talked about it, there was a sort of reluctant kind of an attempt to find a way of formulating this. You start talking about the civil service. Maybe there's a sort of constitutional infrastructure that got passed on. Maybe that's all right. That seems to me to be, he's sort of being, and I'm presuming this, that he's just being prodded along, knowing what you have to say from the government position in order to say it. And I think on that basis, the interesting part is that the government wants this message out there, and I don't think it's a very healthy or interesting or positive message to have.
Russell?
I didn't hear the line, so and I'm sure he didn't conflate success and slavery in the same sentence. Surely not. I would imagine, and as I said, I didn't hear the line, that he was talking about the Commonwealth, and I guess trying to conflate some kind of positive to the Commonwealth. I think, as Iain says, if you assume that slavery and the Commonwealth are the same thing and go hand in hand, then I think that personally would be a mistake. I don't think the Commonwealth was about slavery. Slavery was a consequence of the Commonwealth, for sure, but the Commonwealth was not orchestrated for the purposes of slavery. If I was Nadim Zahawi, I guess, and I was sitting here defending that position, it would be the fact that we were once a Great Britain. We were once conquerors of the world in terms of trade and in terms of opening the world up. And as a consequence, the Victorians did rather well for us in terms of building and entrepreneurialism and the wealth that the Victorians created as a consequence of trading with the whole world. I can see the cynical smiles across the panel here. So, look, I think to label what he said as trying to conflate slavery being a good thing, rather than us learning the lessons of slavery so that such an abhorrence is not repeated again, I think they are very different things.
Now, Dalia, this is your area of expertise. You're doing a lot of research on this issue, so I'm going to come to you after the news because I want you to have enough time to talk about it. So let's go to the news, and Giles, of course, will come to you on that as well. So let's go to the news first. Holly Jones has the news headlines. It's 8:31 on LBC.
Chelsea owner Roman Abramovich has reportedly suffered symptoms of poisoning after a meeting in Kiev. At least 2 Ukrainian negotiators are also said to have experienced red eyes and peeling skin on their hands and face. Peace talks between Russia and Ukraine are due to restart for the first time in more than 2 weeks tomorrow. It's understood another P&O ferry has been detained after failing inspection. Officials have been making checks on the Pride of Kent earlier. The company has been told to reverse its decision to sack 800 staff, or the government will block the move. And in the last few minutes, the Academy has said it condemns Will Smith slapping Chris Rock at last night's Oscars. A formal review has now been opened into what happened. LBC weather: showers in the south tonight with rain pushing into the far north, a low of -1.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:35, we have Dalia, Gebriel and Iain Dunt and Giles, Whittell and Russell Quirk with us, taking your calls 0345 6060 973. Now, Adam in Bermondsey, we're in the middle of answering his question. In light of Kemi Badenoch and Nadine Zahawi's discussions today, what benefits have slavery and colonialism given to people of colour? Now, Dalia, you're doing a lot of research into this area. Now, I haven't heard either of those two politicians say that there were any benefits to slavery at all. I think it'd be quite incredible if they did, given their own particular heritages. What's your view?
Well, I think, first of all, the hard and fast distinction between colonialism and slavery is kind of a false one. These things are historically dependent upon one another. We wouldn't have had the transatlantic slave trade without the foundations laid by empire. I think that this comment from Zahawi is, he phrased it as we should teach both sides of the empire. We should teach both sides of colonialism. And that comes across as this very balanced, mature soundbite. But it hides what the actual much more sinister motive, I would say, is here, which is to downplay and silence and undermine a growing movement within education to have a much more rigorous appraisal and honest appraisal of Britain's role in empire and Britain's role in the slave trade as well, and how that has created the world that we exist in today. It was a long time ago, but when I did my A-level in history, I studied 2 years on 19th century and 20th century British history.
Me too.
The word empire was not mentioned a single time. Now, that means that you are putting young people out into the world with a very deficient understanding of why the world looks the way it does today. And so when you look at it from that perspective, from the perspective that the orthodoxy within education has been to either completely ignore that colonialism ever existed or to whitewash it, for him to come out and say this now, to say we should teach about the benefits of colonialism, it's very disingenuous. And I think his point, the example that he drew on was, in Iraq, empire gave us a British civil service system. Now, we've been talking throughout this whole show about the violation of sovereignty that the Russian invasion of Ukraine consists of. What was colonialism if not a collective undermining of the sovereignty of almost a quarter of the world's population?
Which is true when you look at it through 21st century eyes, but when you look at it through sort of 17th, 18th century or 19th century eyes, I mean, do we not have to take into account that it was a very different world, very different priorities that people had, even though we would consider a lot of them reprehensible today?
I think there were different priorities for the colonizers. The people who were colonized, the people who were oppressed, they always knew that what was being done to them was wrong.
Did they? That's quite
Absolutely.
An assertion.
Of course they did. They resisted colonialism and slavery at every stage.
Sorry, I thought you meant the people that... I thought you meant the colonisers.
No. The colonizers, their priorities, their values were different. But I think to argue that the values of the past were wholesale different to the ones we have now, I would argue that the people who were colonized, the people who were oppressed, always knew that what was being done to them was wrong, but they were actively suppressed. And so I think, the British civil service system, the Iraqis didn't ask for that. It was forced. It wasn't something that was that they welcomed with open arms. It was forced upon them through violence.
A lot of the former colonies still operate a sort of Westminster-style system of government, don't they? So Nadine Zahawi presumably would then argue, well, that is a positive legacy of empire.
Well, I think the legacy of empire that betrays is the fact that Britain still, or the British culture is still deemed globally the hegemonic culture. And so in order to participate in the global system of governance, you have to take on the kinds of legal structures and the civil service structures and the governance structures of the British, and you have to kind of maintain that. And that again is the ways in which those colonial inequalities continue today, where sovereignty has not still been achieved.
But that's now their choice, though, surely. All those years, it's their choice to continue to adopt that mode of government. And are you suggesting, though, that colonialism should only be taught in schools from a negative perspective?
I think that it should be taught from an honest perspective, which unfortunately does not put Britain in a very positive light.
But honesty needs balance, right?
But I don't think that when you look at the facts in a balanced way, you can come from that and say, well, there was some good and some bad. It's clear that even the things that are named to be good were still imposed through violence, and therefore that makes it wrong.
Well, Nadeem Zahawi will be sitting in your seat in 3 weeks' time.
Wow. You should invite... Why don't you invite me on that day? Let me have a pop.
You can call in that day because he's going to take listener calls for an hour, so that may be one of them. Michael on the text says, I'm a person of colour. I wouldn't be here if slavery never happened, as one of my ancestors married their slave master. So to me, that's a benefit. There's always one.
Wow.
Giles.
Wow.
Well, I'll defer to Dalia on the sort of the framework that colonialism and empire provided for the establishment of slavery. But what you said after that about doing an A-level with no mention of empire just shows how much older I am than you. Because when I did mine, it was I'm embarrassed to say, it was all about the positives of colonialism. We had a special subject that was the scramble for Africa, and it was a race between the British and the French to colonise more bits of West Africa and do what they could with it. And the French had the explicit mission civilisatrice, the civilising mission. And the lucky colonised people would get citizenship of metropolitan France, and British did it a different way. It was just a question, literally, in my lifetime when I was 18, of which was better. And in fact, as I recall then, and doing a degree in history afterwards, slightly more sophisticated then, but the whole of history was about empire. And I suppose the only thing that you could say, or certainly was argued then, was that if you stacked up British colonialism next to Genghis Khan's version, perhaps the more brutal Roman versions, it came out better, but only if you were assuming that history was a series of stories of empire building.
Adam, I might regret this, but do you want to come back?
Well, I mean, that was an emotional roller coaster. I liked the after the break, the lady who just spoke, and I obviously
Dalia.
almost spat out my tea when I misheard what I thought you'd said. No, well, I suppose I'm an open book. I'm really interested. I'm interested to hear what the future tells us is the benefits, and obviously, again, as I said, hopefully it will do so with Germany too, so we can have equal hatred or an equal understanding that times change and we're looking at things with a modern view. So clearly, how far back can we apportion that kind of excuse to horrible things that have happened in history? But I am open to hearing, because I mean, it would be great, as I said, to understand people of no colour's views on my cultural history and my experience. So I just would love to hear the other side of the coin. So thank you all for your help and have a good evening.
Adam, thank you very much. Now let's take an email from Mohammed. These questions are primarily for you, Iain, and for Iain Dunt. I think you misunderstand my role in this discussion. Can conservatism and liberalism ever be reconciled with one another? And what is the relationship between Whiggism, conservatism and liberalism? Don't say we don't have intellectual questions on this programme.
You did this sort of thing.
Oh, we do occasionally, only when you're on there. Because you are an expert on liberalism. You have a go at that.
Yeah, I mean, you can have almost any kind of liberal. I mean, you can't really have a sort of full communist liberal and you can't have a full fascist liberal, but you can certainly have conservative liberals, you can have socialist liberals. So liberalism is your belief in the freedom of the individual and in reason and moderation, the separation of powers, these core ideas that basically prevent us from killing one another and try to preserve this sphere of freedom that we all have. And you can take that thought down a very, very left-wing point of view, you can take it down a very, very right-wing point of view. So yeah, in fact, I would actually go further and say that it's absolutely pivotal for any country, really, to have a really vibrant liberal movement on the right and on the left. And the second that that's not there, regardless of which of those two sides you find yourself on, as a country, you're in real trouble.
Because liberal is a word that people purloin in a way, don't they? They think it's a positive word, so therefore everyone wants to be a liberal.
Well, they used to. I don't know if you've been on Twitter recently, but it's been a very long time since anyone...
In the US in particular.
Well, you're right on that, but in this country, I think that, I mean, I would say I'm a social liberal, but an economic conservative. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably the position that a lot of people take in this country at the moment. Anybody else want to come in on this?
No, it's way too intellectual for me, frankly. I'm still trying to get my head around the fact that Boris Johnson's supposed to be a Gladstonian liberal, but the man that's also...
That's what I think I am.
But the man that's increasing taxes and restricting
freedoms. Without the
freedoms.
empire bit, by the way.
Yeah. But restricting taxes
well,
and freedom, left, right and centre. So how on earth can he be a liberal when we've been through what we have in the last 2 years under Boris Johnson?
Because if you're a conservative or a liberal, you say, I believe in freedom. Well, who doesn't believe in freedom apart from fascists?
What kind of freedom?
Or communists.
That's the thing.
Giles?
It's over my head as well, but I would like to drag it to the States, as you mentioned. It's an insult to my in-laws and half the American political nation, the word liberal, which implies perhaps that conservatism over there has strayed away from liberalism fundamentally. And under Trump, I suspect that is exactly what's happened. And if I'm allowed to drag it from there back to where we started in Russia, you were making the point that Putin's situation, and bear with me, in Ukraine was untenable. Unfortunately, it's all too tenable still and secure and firm within Russia, where everyone, as they had an experiment with liberalism in the 90s and jettisoned it because it was humiliating for everybody, and now they believe the propaganda. And when we consider what a very serious problem that is, we should consider what a very serious problem the American the equivalent is, which is 70 million Republican voters, or perhaps 70%, 60% of Republican voters.
There was about 75 million, wasn't it, that voted for Trump?
And still believing that the election was rigged, despite living in a, we thought, liberal political culture with free press.
Well, when you said you were going to drag it back, I thought you were going to say to Saint Nazaire, and I was thinking, this is going to be interesting. Dalia.
Yeah, I guess one question I would actually have for you, Iain, as someone who wrote a book on this, is, we often consider the kind of 19th century Enlightenment thinkers to be the golden age of liberalism as an ideology, that, the freedom of the individual, etc. How do you square that with the fact that some of the archetypal liberal intellectuals were also keen advocates of colonialism, which obviously was a massive violation of the freedom of the individual, and very much centred the idea of freedom of the individual and reason and all the things that you claim, was very much centred around a white British citizen man, and not on the doctrine of reason defended eugenics, for example. How do you square that contradiction?
Well, you can use reason to sort of argue for any point of view. I don't think that reason is sort of a white concept or a Western concept. I think what you're discussing there is the great kind of taint in liberalism, like the betrayal of it. And that's the community of the free. As soon as those ideas get expounded, we start talking about the freedom of the individual. As soon as it happens, certain people get excluded. So you start going, okay, so black people don't count, right? And women don't count, and gay people don't count. And throughout liberal history, you exclude those people. And step by step, as you progress, more and more you get the radical struggle predominantly from those communities, and they claim what I would call the liberal dream.
OK, we'll come to more of your calls in a moment. Let me remind you, you're not listening to Radio 4, you are indeed listening to LBC. It's 8:48.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:51. Dalia, Gebriel, Iain Dunt, Giles, Whittell and Russell Quirk with me answering your questions. Let's go to Anthony in Staines. Hi, Anthony.
Hi there, Ian. Hi, everyone. My question is it time for regime change at number 11 Downing Street?
Just by the way, I'm not sure I think this was in the news bulletin, but the first fines for lockdown breaches in Downing Street are expected to be issued imminently after Scotland Yard concluded that laws were broken at the heart of government. I suppose that relates more to 10 Downing Street than 11 Downing Street, but Russell Quirk, what do you think?
Albeit the fines presumably go to 11 Downing Street. In terms of Treasury.
That was biting political satire there, Russell.
Look, I don't think so. I think at his heart, Rishi Sunak is actually a low-tax conservative. He's a man to my own heart.
He hides it well.
He does, but look, he's not the man necessarily making the decisions, is he? So, of course, he writes the Spring Statement.
He's the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
He writes the budget, but it's signed off and approved by the Prime Minister and his advisors, of course. So, he kept something like £200 billion up his sleeve, which, of course, is for the next 12 to 18 months or so in the run-up to the next election. Look, I think Rishi's OK by me. I think the regime change needs to start next door.
Giles?
Yes, it's time for regime change. He's not the man for the moment. He doesn't seem to realise that there was one colossal spending requirement that he was ignoring to fund an energy transition, and there was another one that's just come along to fund defence, which he also appears to be resisting. Wrong man for the time.
Dalia?
Absolutely. I think that he has made a series of political choices that is going to have an incredibly devastating effect on working class people in this country, and that is not something he should get away with.
Very brief, Iain?
Yeah, I mean, look, he's rubbish. You couldn't see. I mean, it wasn't immediately visible.
Political commentary there.
Well, for a while it wasn't obvious, right? Because he kept on paying everyone all the money, and there was a nice Instagram photo of him looking shiny with a blah, blah, blah. But now you're actually getting to have a good look at him, not just in terms of presentation, but also in terms of his ideology. Both of them are actually rubbish, and that's what people are recognising now.
He needs to change his PR team. You see the picture the next day after the Spring Statement of him filling up his car with petrol. I mean, who on earth sanctioned that?
It wasn't his car, was it?
And he did the funny thing with a card.
Oh, yeah, he doesn't know how to shop.
That was odd, wasn't it? Whether that's justification for replacing him as Chancellor, I'm not wholly sure. But Anthony, your view?
Yeah, I think we could do with a woman. We've never had a woman Chancellor before. I don't know which one, but perhaps Gillian Keegan or Therese Coffey. Liz Truss is a bit busy at the moment, but those two perhaps.
Well, she could compete with Rishi Sunak on the Insta photos, couldn't she? Oh. Anthony, thank you very much indeed for that. Now, a text question from Denise in Harrow. We're actually going to be talking about this subject in the next hour. Should Will Smith lose his Oscar for slapping Chris Rock, or was it fair enough? Was it a slap? I thought it was a punch.
A slap. It was an open-handed slap.
Was it? Okay.
I think he should do the classy thing and overcompensate and give it back. I don't think you're going to see the Academy demanding it back. But that is what I think should happen. I think the argument that somehow because of his own background, his own journey, it was somehow justified is nonsense.
Dalia?
Look, I think that, first of all, every woman was looking at her husband sideways this today, just being like, would you smack a man in broad public daylight if someone disrespected me? But I think when you look at the Oscars, there are multiple aggressions that the Oscars have forgiven of their winners, right? Like they continue to give out awards to Roman Polanski, even after we knew what he was up to. Harvey Weinstein, when it was an open secret that he was assaulting women in Hollywood. So I think it would be a bit odd, whether or not Will Smith should, of his own volition, give it back, but I think it would seem a little bit odd to apply this rule to Will Smith when you already have a history of accepting pretty awful behaviour from the giants of Hollywood.
Russell?
No doubt he overreacted, but I think it would also be an overreaction to give the Oscar back. What's been interesting today, I think, apart from, yes, the open-handed slap and how outrageous that is and so on, although it made for more interesting Oscars than we've seen for many, many years, I think, certainly not woke anymore, is it, is the question as to whether comedians should be allowed to say such things. And so we're back to the whole freedom of speech debate. You know, Chris Rock is getting as much stick for making fun of Will Smith's wife's hair, and I think that's a very, very slippery slope indeed.
Iain?
There's no one saying that he can't say it. It's just, how good a call was that? I mean, how nice is that?
Many today have said he shouldn't say it.
Because I don't think they're suggesting that we're going to pass a law or something. I mean, you're basically saying it wasn't a great call on your behalf. And I mean, it's a medical condition that she's got, right? Like, so to go bald for a woman is very different. I'm going to make eye contact with Iain as the two honorary bald men here. For a woman, it's very different to a guy. And I think it takes like a tremendous amount of confidence to just own that thing, which is what she did. And then to just sit there and have this really just cheap gag about what, like a movie in the 90s. It's like, really, it's not even a good gag. So I've got to say, like, it is not all right to hit people. There's no scenario in which you get to do that. And it is he should say sorry. He should say sorry. And he should apologise to him. But honestly, you look at it and you just think, like, it's quite hard to be certain that you wouldn't behave the same way in just that frenzy of anger that you'd have at the moment that event took place.
I should say that Iain Dunt and I are forming a mutual support group called Slapheads Anonymous. Because we both need it sometimes. Thank you very much indeed for that. Now, our fun text for the end, which everybody really looks forward to, is from Callum in Oxford. Cadbury's are shrinking the size of their dairy milk sharing bars by 10%, but will not reduce the price for customers. Which chocolate bar would you hate to see get smaller? This is rather in contrast to the Liberal question, I think, isn't it? Russell, let's start with you.
I'll have to plumb for Turkish Delight, I think, because it's such a small bar already. If they shrunk it to any smaller version of its existing size, there'd be nothing left of it.
Do people still really eat that? My dad always used to like that. I always think it's old people that eat Turkish Delight.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah,
love a bit of Turkish Delight.
And anything else?
For me, the Toblerone, I can't take any more shrinking of that. My heart has already been broken by they increased the gaps between the Toblerone, so it looks as long as it originally was, but it's much less chocolate.
They took the chunks.
Outrageous, outrageous. That's my red line. Yeah, that's where my liberalism runs out.
Iain,
Cadbury's cream eggs.
Oh. You see, we agree on so much.
It's because it looks like our head.
Yes, exactly.
No, you need to be able to get the whole thing in one just like terrible orgasmic moment of chocolate horror. That's what you need. It needs to be one mouthful.
I did that yesterday. I was in the car and I ate one and put it all in. And I had to stop the car because I was coughing so much. All the chocolate was going over the dashboard.
All over the windscreen.
Giles?
The Snickers, it's already down to
Don't
a
like
two...
that. Don't like that.
Come on,
No.
it's already down to a 2-bite bar, which is very unsatisfying considering it's such a fundamentally satisfying product.
No, it really isn't.
Have you got a problem with
I'm going to vouch for Snickers as well.
It should still be called Marathon, shouldn't it?
Oh!
Well, that was a quality debate, wasn't it? Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Iain Dunt, Dalia Gebriel, Giles Whittell and Russell Quirk. We have another cross question lined up for you with some excellent guests tomorrow at 8 o'clock. Coming up in a moment, I want to talk a bit more about Will Smith and Chris Rock. I had never heard of Chris Rock until today. I'm ashamed to admit. I know, it's shocking, isn't it? So whose side are you on this? Or is it really that simple about picking sides? Look, I'd love to hear from you in a moment. And do you think that Will Smith should hand back the Oscar? You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. US President Biden says he's not concerned his remarks about Vladimir Putin could escalate the conflict in Ukraine. He's been facing questions after saying Russia's leader cannot remain in power.
I was expressing the moral outrage I felt